My name is Karen Solati. I'm the Associate Dean of Research and Innovation in the Faculty of Forestry. And it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to another research seminar. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to acknowledge that UBC Point Grey campus is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. This land has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam people who pass their tradition, history, and knowledge from one generation to the next on this land. We are very grateful to be able to learn, teach, and do our research on this land. I also would like to thank Frederick and Louise for helping with the AV system. Thanks a lot. Sonia and Jillian also helped with the poster for the seminar, and Karen helped with sending the email around and putting that into your calendar. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lorien Nesbitt. Dr. Lorien Nesbitt is an assistant professor of urban forestry and environmental justice in the Department of Forest Resources Management in our faculty. She is internationally recognized for her research, and she has been collaborating with communities and other organizations across the globe to co-create more livable, sustainable, and equitable cities. At UBC, Dr. Nesbitt leads the Urban Natures Lab, which focuses on advancing environmental justice through urban greening and planning. The lab's research addresses key topics such as green gentrification, recognition of justice in urban forest stewardship, and supporting planetary health in the face of the climate crisis. Their work is highly collaborative, partnering with cities, regional governments, and community-based organizations to co-create impactful transdisciplinary research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nesbitt.
Thank you very much, Charity. That was very kind, and thank you all for coming today. I'm feeling a little bit nervous about presenting to my colleagues, and it's an interesting experience. And I guess it's because I'm going to have to see you around the halls afterwards. But I'm really grateful for this opportunity to share some of the work that I'm doing with my students and other researchers in this faculty and other institutions as well as with our partners. Today I'm going to talk about co-creating just green cities. There's a lot of buzzwords in this title, co-creating, empowerment. But beyond that, I think, I hope that this research is meaningful to you as residents of this city or this region, people who interact with urban nature and who have a role in its stewardship. And who are hopefully interested in creating more sustainable futures together. As I go through the presentation, I welcome you as lived experience experts of the social ecological systems of cities to raise your hand and ask questions, provide comments, express yourselves how you need to. I will also give time for questions at the end, but I would prefer that you stop me if something is unclear or if you just have something that you want to say for a more interesting presentation. I also want to thank Tarana for the land acknowledgement at the beginning of the seminar. A lot of what we're talking about here is about recognizing what has been on the land and what is on the land in terms of territory, activity, governance, rights and responsibilities. And so I hope that some of what I talk about today can inform some of our responsibilities in this territory that is the Musqueam territory. So in urban forestry, there has been this sort of increasing discourse around what is often called urban green equity or tree equity. Who here has heard about urban green equity? Awesome. Okay, so which was not really the case maybe 10, 15 years ago. And so we've seen this growing concern for environmental justice in our discipline, especially sort of in the first couple decades of the 21st century. And we have this predominant focus on distribution, which is great because I love maps. And I had created lots of maps in my life. And I actually, during my PhD, wanted to create like an art exhibit of maps that I had made because I guess I really like them. I never did that, but I love maps and I've done a lot of work on distributional equity. And so we've seen this proliferation of research, some of which comes out of my lab, some of which comes from other jurisdictions from all over the world, looking at how urban forests and associated vegetation are distributed in cities, and whether those distributions suggest patterns of inequity where people from marginalized populations may have less access to those resources. More recently, we see the tree equity score from American Forests, and this is this visual tool that allows usually cities to map sort of where there are trees, where there are no trees, and where there are these kind of like demographics that might suggest less power in urban space and identify areas of potential inequity. And this is a great tool, and it also makes me very grumpy because this tool is sort of a first step, right? And it's really being adopted in a wholehearted and exciting way by practitioners. And so people are standing up and saying things like, we have solved tree equity. Literally, this was a sentence from the Canadian Urban Forestry Conference recently. And well, no, we have not solved tree equity, but we have some maps, and that is great. So I'm going to talk about what we might want to do next now that we have some of these maps. So what does something like the tree equity score tell us, or what do these spatial analyses of the distribution of trees and other greenness tell us? They identify areas with low canopy, right? They summarize key demographics in each neighborhood. They highlight areas of where indicators of marginalization intersect with low canopy cover. And in the case of going further doing a spatial analysis, we may be able to predict whether people of certain identities or populations of certain identities may or may not be likely to have access to the benefits of urban forests. So these areas may be vulnerable to climate change. They may be disconnected from nature, and they may be seeking support to increase local greening, but are they? And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is trying to get us away from this idea that we know what should happen in these areas towards an idea that we should maybe be engaging in questioning and conversations in those areas if we really do want to solve tree equity. I also don't like the term tree equity because it's an American term. Green equity. Americans. So this interest in urban green equity is occurring within the complexity of two factors that are increasingly challenging urban forestry practitioners and scholars. And these are declining canopy cover and green gentrification. So we're seeing more and more evidence of declining canopy cover and declining greenness generally in cities in Canada and around the world. And you're probably not surprised by this, being people who live in cities. And so this is usually attributed to two factors. One, increasing densification of housing and other infrastructure without removing other types of infrastructure like car infrastructure. And so we're reducing the space available for urban trees. This means planting smaller trees, and it also means lower tree survival in some cases. And urban forests are experiencing the pressures of climate change, just like we are. And so we have fairly poor survival metrics, according to most of the research, although I think people don't really have a good handle on how well trees are surviving in different contexts. And this is an important area of research. We're also seeing an increasing or growing discourse on green gentrification. And so my lab has been looking at this for the past few years. Green gentrification is typically or traditionally defined as the physical or psychological displacement of marginalized communities due to improvements in urban forests that either increase the cost of living or create a sense of exclusion and barriers to urban forest access. And so the idea is that if you install a park in a neighborhood, that's going to increase the cost of real estate. People, especially renters, may be forced to move out of that neighborhood as things become more expensive. And what actually usually happens, and we'll talk more about this, is that a neighborhood is redeveloped with an aim to attract higher income in-movers. And so those people who have been living in the neighborhood are not able to stay there and are not able to return. And this is the kind of thing, by the way, that is likely to happen along the Broadway corridor. The other sort of way of looking at this is that even if you are able to stay in your neighborhood, the neighborhood may no longer be for you. And so this may mean that the businesses in your neighborhood are not businesses where you can afford to shop or that reflect your cultural identity, or that the green spaces have been changed in ways that reduce your connection to them or your sense of place. So we have this kind of broad definition of green gentrification, and somewhat contested as well, because it's really only been emerging in the literature in the last 10 years or so. And so a few years ago, we decided to ask, what is green gentrification? What does this concept mean and how does it operate in different ways? And so my student Dan Sachs led this scoping review that looked at a lot of the literature to try and understand how we might characterize green gentrification and undertake dimensional analysis of the concept. And so we came up with these 3 main dimensions and 6 secondary dimensions. And they really have to do with the way we think about greening, the way we design greening, and the way we implement greening. So this idea of conceptual foundations is really around sort of sustainability discourses, the idea that green is always good. And if green is always good, then it really doesn't matter if we are accumulating capital and displacing people when we do gentrification. We did some greening, isn't that great? And I continue to be honest, I think that this is like actually the most serious expression of green gentrification. We see this all the time, and not a lot of people like this research for that reason. It's like a big type of research to do. Anyways. Then we have this idea of green gentrification operating through the design and implementation phases. And so design procedures and outcomes, especially around large-scale redevelopment projects like we see in Vancouver, are such that greening development can exclude the perspectives of vulnerable residents, either because the neighborhood is not being redeveloped for them, or because consultation is delegated to a secondary group like a consultant who does not have any power to take those needs, visions, whatever, from residents and move those towards expression in the final iteration of the project. And I mean, I talk about this a lot in one of my classes, but large-scale redevelopment projects, have their own governance systems even. And so democratic accountability tends to be broken down in these cases. And then we have social-spatial change, which is what that original definition of green gentrification is really about, right? So we implement a green space, things become more expensive, some people have to move, or if they stay, some people feel displaced because their neighborhood doesn't feel like it always has. So we did this work, and then we wanted to understand, well, how is this operating in Canadian cities? What are practitioners, especially urban greening and planning practitioners, doing about this, thinking about this? What's a more grounded way to understand this concept? And so we decided to look in Vancouver and Toronto, 2 cities that are investing a lot in urban greening and that also experience gentrification pressures. And so we started with a survey of urban greening and planning practitioners. I led with a lot of help from other people in my lab and our partners. And we wanted to identify the meaning and scope of knowledge about green gentrification from a practitioner perspective. And then we also wanted to explore if and how practitioners encounter this concept in their work, including any barriers they face in addressing the phenomenon. So we just did this online survey and some kind of basic qualitative and quantitative analyses. We found that practitioners have a good awareness of green gentrification, but less familiarity with the nuances of the concept. So like the drivers of green gentrification or their role within it. Interestingly, the sort of traditional basic definition of green gentrification was the primary one understood by practitioners, where greening drives gentrification rather than kind of the systems within which it happens driving green gentrification. And there was this focus on physical displacement. And I think partly because of that definition, there's sort of this idea that it's like not really happening in Canada. Because, yeah, we're not gonna go like plant a tree in front of someone's house and then, you know, suddenly someone's gonna be forced to move, right? So a simplified concept can sometimes lead to us feeling like it's not operating in our community. We also found some evidence of resistance to green gentrification theory or a lack of critical reflection in the role of practitioners and their scope of work, whether they could deal with this concept. Also not that surprising. So there's a real focus right now on urban green equity in urban forest practice. People want to deal with inequitable distribution of urban forest canopy. And I think green gentrification complicates the narrative. It's also a concept that operates across systems. And so we had lots of practitioners saying, well, look, what am I going to do? I deal with the trees and parks. I'm not dealing with housing or transit. How do I deal with this as a problem in a real way? And so they identified these barriers to understanding and doing something about this issue, especially limited institutional capacity, limited access to data and relevant knowledge. So like, is this happening in my community or not? And if it is, how is it happening? As well as restrictions from policies and mandates. So like, this isn't part of my job. I also don't have time or money to do it, as well as a lack of appropriate engagement strategies and also engagement, funding, and time. So we did that survey-based work. And then we thought, okay, let's interview some of these practitioners to get a more nuanced understanding of what green gentrification is, how they encounter it, what we might do about it. And we came up with these 4 main themes through that analysis. So practitioners talking about the drivers of green gentrification, the connection between greening and development, mitigating green gentrification, and being equity seeking rather than gentrification avoiding. I found that last one particularly interesting, this idea that because in a lot of ways greening is always good, we're equity seeking as a discipline rather than avoiding gentrification. We're not doing wrong, we're doing right. As with most interview-based work, there's a lot to say about it, but on a basic level, the main takeaways are things that development commonly funds or accommodates greening. So a lot of the ways in which urban forestry departments get money to do the greening work through development cost charges, which either are used as a green fund or require a developer to install green infrastructure in some way around their development. So this is a really important part of what urban forestry is. And so participants were talking about how this can uphold existing inequities as well as create new ones. So if greening is done alongside development, then greening is being created for people moving into these higher cost developments, as well as displacing original residents to other locations where greening may not be part of the city. However, the concept of green gentrification also seems to have limited utility for practitioners right now. This spatiotemporal concept that operates across multiple systems that doesn't seem to be part of the work right now within practice. And then respondents also talked about the need for affordability and equity policies that work across urban systems. Surprisingly, and we hear these themes over and over around equity. So we wanted to get at some solutions to this frustrating problem of green gentrification, which I have generally stopped researching, by the way, because I find it so frustrating. But, we held these 4 workshops with practitioners two in Vancouver and 2 in Toronto. And we first gave them opportunities to provide feedback on and reflections on previous research. So the research I've shared so far is research that has received feedback and comment from those people who participated, as well as other experts in these workshops. And then we asked them to analyze local case studies and offer strategies to overcome barriers to equity. And so we use this neat method that was adapted from Esther Turnhout's work, where we ask participants to envision an ideal world in which they removed a key barrier to equity and then examined how this might change, what kind of outcomes this would produce over time. And then in the real world, identify steps they could take to overcome this barrier. What did they do first, second, and third? And I think about this in short, medium, and long term time horizons. And it looks like this. They have this like center hexagon that is the barrier, and then they build out implications from there in conversation with others in their small group. And so these workshops identified some strategies for equity that I'll talk about briefly. So one is systemic and equity-based approaches. So the idea that equity should be a foundational principle and enacted in citywide strategies across systems, and that it needs to be addressed both across sort of the system, the different like conceptual systems or infrastructural systems of cities, but also at different scales, so municipal and regional scales, identifying key actors, synergies, and conflicts. And then the need to introduce new policies, particularly around equity, or revise existing ones. They also talked about coordination and planning. And so the idea that we should be engaging in interdepartmental or organizational coordination and planning before we implement a project in order to identify potential conflicts or unintended outcomes. Aligning equity strategies with existing policies and initiatives rather than competing with them. And then the need to gather data and conduct assessments, and really involving diverse actors in those assessments. Of course, community engagement. And the meaning, this comes up so often in my work. So many practitioners like want me to tell them the answer to community engagement, and it's always like this complex answer. So if anyone has like the silver bullet, you look at that. So I don't have it, but these experts who were really very experienced in community engagement talked about the importance of engaging with residents and local organizations, businesses, as well as developers to understand their priorities, how they work together or against each other. Talking about communicating equity strategies so that people can get on board with them, so that they can understand them, so that they make sense. They talked about developing relationships of trust, so showing up continually for your community partners, being a trustworthy member of government or institution, and then that community engagement should be the first step and an ongoing process. So bringing in relevant actors and community members early on in the process before you're making some of those foundational decisions, and then continuing to check in as you further develop a project and see its outcomes. And then finally, resource mobilization and partnerships. I've never heard any urban forestry practitioner tell me that they have enough time or money as a city or department. And so they talked about the need to secure funding and resources, especially for things that are specifically equity focused or that work across sectors. And so this means identifying existing funding as well as creating new funding pathways through partnerships. And we see a lot increasingly of partnerships developed around urban greening and planning at the municipal and regional level. I think a lot of our practice partners hold a lot of really interesting networks that enable their work. And using resources and partnerships to support sustainable strategies over time. I think especially because we're dealing with some temporal complexity in these cases, having those ongoing relationships and partnerships means that it's not all on one organization to keep something going. Okay, so we've talked about these complexities of canopy cover and green gentrification, and this is all kind of more past work in our lab. And so we were left with this idea of, so what now? We've been doing this research on gentrification. It's this sort of intractable and complex problem. How should we be focusing our attention and our energies in order to make positive change? Where do we go from here? So what we're trying is looking at recognitional justice in urban forestry and planning as sort of a foundational concept in how we do urban green equity or how we conceive of environmental justice. This is being expressed through two SSHRC-funded projects. The first is called Networks of Care for Green Healthy Cities, and the second is called Charting New Pathways to Achieving Recognitional Justice in Urban Greening. And I have no idea what to name that second project, right? Like we've been doing this for 2 years now, I think, and I can't figure out a shorter name. So here we are, that's the name. Anyway, they're two distinct projects, but they have some things in common in that they're both looking to understand and respect local stewardship activities, the values those enact, as well as the experiences of urban environments and social ecologies that exist in the communities who are living in those places, who are doing the work of stewarding nature, who are caring for each other as we experience more and more climate impacts. And we really have a focus on plural, marginalized perspectives and activities. So looking for difference, looking for perspectives that may not be highlighted in mainstream discourse, and trying to engage with those, understand them, and recognize them. And so we're working across Vancouver, New York in the US, Medellin, Colombia, and Temuco, Chile, to try and get at some of these problems. And I think, from my perspective, what we're trying to do with these projects and sort of associated work is co-create the social infrastructure that we need for grassroots urban greening and sustainable futures to be enacted. And so this, I kind of stolen this from Dan, but the idea that we should move from what land uses or activities do we want here, sort of this blank slate blue sky thinking, to what already exists and how can it be supported? What is the work that people are already doing? How can we get to know that and help enable that? So the first thing we did in this project was literature review, of course, because how rounded can you? No, because as we're academics, I can't resist a literature review, but also to try and clarify some of our thinking around whether we are recognizing diverse values and knowledges in our own practice in urban greening as academics. And so we undertook to describe how different values of the more than human world are represented in urban greening literature, analyze the recognitional justice implications of these expressions, both in research and in practice, and then outline some future visions for more inclusive urban greening, which is really intended to start a conversation because obviously, although this was a very collective effort with lots of different co-authors, it's not really for us to determine future visions without broader involvement. And yeah, I want to acknowledge that this was something I led. Jess Quinton, Amber Grant, Dan Sachs were really important people who helped with this, as well as Rob Kozak, Shannon Hagerman, Layla Harris, our partners at the US Forest Service. It has been really interesting to kind of work with them through this issue. So we used something called the Life Framework of Values, which I have been enjoying as a framework to think through diversity in a simple way. And so the Life Framework of Values looks at the values of nature that we hold and separates those into these four kind of buckets or dimensions that obviously overlap with each other, but help us to reflect on what are the primary values that are advanced by a piece of work or an activity. And these are living from nature, living in nature, living with nature, and living as nature. In the first kind of quadrant, we have living from nature, where nature is a resource for human needs and consumption. And this really aligns a lot with provisioning ecosystem services, regulating services as well, economic analyses of the benefits of nature, as well as these really practical considerations around like urban nature as a source of food, or the source of clean water. What I find interesting about this frame is that although it is often conceived of as extractive, it doesn't need to be. It can be highly reciprocal. And a lot of the reciprocal values that we see in this frame are from indigenous ecologies as well as the global south, where people are literally living from nature. And so treat it with a lot of respect. The next frame is living in nature, which really sees nature as space for leisure, recreation, and social interaction. And a lot of this this frame aligns with a lot of the health literature around urban greening. So being in nature allows us to get these health benefits. It allows us to be with each other. It's also a frame in which distributional equity analyses tend to fall, so whether we have the opportunity to be in nature or not. And I think aligns with all, how we plan our green spaces in cities often as well. So this is a very dominant framing in urban greening research and practice. Living with nature recognizes nature's intrinsic value and its role in supporting ecosystem processes, so supporting ecosystem services, as well as a lot of conservation-oriented greening literature, and some of the sort of more practical, like urban forest management literature that looks at the ways in which we are selecting tree species, for example, for ecological outcomes, or the ways in which we're managing urban nature to support the complexity of those ecosystems. So whether we're mowing lawns and what time of year, for example. And then finally, as nature, this idea that humans and nature are one, and that nature has agency, rights, and responsibilities. And so we see this in indigenous ecologies, we see this in the idea of biocultural diversity, as well as work around the agency of nature, the ways in which nature expresses that agency in spaces that may have been abandoned by humans, as well as there's some sort of like interesting takes on green gentrification where they look at sort of the ways in which place and the nature in that place influences the dynamics of human interactions and decisions. We also see this in sort of political ecology work and the idea of urban metabolism. So there's lots of interesting, like, I found this interesting in terms of the thinking through what nature can mean in these different frames. In a somewhat unsystematic way, we also believe that the sort of dominant frames in the urban greening literature are living in nature and then living from nature, with some representation from living with nature, and then very little in terms of living as nature. So most of the literature that's been used to describe living as nature were pulled from outside of the urban greening discipline and are not really reflected in urban greening practice in terms of sort of policies and plans. So moving on from the literature review, we wanted to also recognize diverse communities and their work. And so in this work, we're asking the questions, how do stewardship activities express total values or bioculture? So the idea that human culture and non-human biodiversity interact and reflect and shape each other. So we're looking at what is naturalized, or what do we see as like inevitable, natural in our disciplines, and what's excluded, as well as what pathways can we use to co-create towards recognitional justice. And so we're undertaking a policy analysis, discourse interviews with urban greening and planning professionals, as well as walking interviews with civic stewards. We will be doing stewardship and resident surveys, and eventually co-creative workshops, stewardship salons, and artistic projects around network building, co-learning, and policy change. And we're following the principle of trying to get qualitative insight that will drive well-specified quantitative analysis and then co-creative action. So we're kind of at the policy analysis and discourse analysis is ongoing, and then we're in the middle of the walking interviews work. So walking interviews, what have we learned? First of all, I've done a few walking interviews, but this has mostly been done by Dan Sachs as well as Johanna Bach. And there will be other students working on this soon. Lucas Ritchie, maybe Magdalena, we'll see. And Amber Grant has also been supporting this as well. And so we have learned that urban forest stewardship can be resistance. It can be resistance to existing practices and policies, existing ways in which, resistance to the ways in which we value or undervalue urban nature. It can be caring for kin, it can be caring for place, it can be a way to care for your community, both human and non-human. It's often knowledge sharing and co-learning. There are lots of opportunities for cross-collaboration, and that tends to drive a lot of people's stewardship work. It can be very focused on food and feeding community, as well as language learning and revitalization. And Johanna had an interesting insight yesterday that stewardship can also be a way to motivate our care for a place and our energy towards caring for it, which is not surprising, but also not something that is highlighted a lot in urban forestry practice. The ways in which, if we allow stewardship and support it, we can also help people feel like energy towards caring for their environment and wellness around creating those environments together. Through our other project, we're also trying to engage the complexity of lived experience. And so this is lived experiences of climate change and so-called nature-based solutions. Another term that might be annoying, but which I use because apparently it's cool. And right now we have an initial focus on seniors' experiences of heat, as well as participatory methods and how they might be useful in this type of work. And so in this work, we're first engaging in a photovoice project, as well as most likely walking interviews and then deliberative and transdisciplinary workshops. This is a highly partnered project, so our partners are from City of Vancouver, Vancouver Coastal Health, the Zero Emissions Innovation Center, Diamond Head Consulting, I'm gonna forget someone, Canada, as well as I also want to really acknowledge the 411 Seniors Network that's been really helpful in connecting us with participants and community leaders. And so I'll share some results here, and these are from Hoi So and Rachel Stern, who have led this work, doing an initial project over the end of summer, I guess, this year, or at least 2024. We'll be doing more of this in the coming summer. And so residents, we have found, experience their city holistically, unsurprisingly, but we don't tend to manage cities holistically, so I think this is an issue. Community-based solutions need to account for transit, housing, and social networks, so basically the daily lives and routines of the people living in these spaces. And participatory methods can help participants see differently and take ownership of both their environment as well as research outcomes. So a few details on what this means. We've seen nice evidence of awareness and reflection through photovoice. So participants found the photo taking process to be positive and something that enhances their mindfulness of their environment. It allows them to pay attention both in the moment, but also going forward. I noticed this myself. Before I did my PhD, I decided I was going to be a documentary filmmaker, and so which did not happen, but I made this little film about urban forests. And after I did this, I was suddenly much more excited about the trees and green spaces in my neighborhood and in my city, and I wanted to do something about it. So I decided to go back to school. Anyways, we also found the importance of social networks and care. And so this is explicitly in heat, in types of heat that may be dangerous for seniors. But strong social networks played a really crucial role in coping during heat events, especially in formal systems of care where people will check in on each other or call on their social networks to help them. We also found, of course, that housing stability is really important for well-being. And some participants talked explicitly about co-ops or cooperative models as things that help them feel like they could stay in their community and be cared for by those around them. And then we heard a little bit about urban greenery's role in cooling. So parks and street trees were the most frequently mentioned green spaces. So parks really for social connection more than cooling, and street trees as things that shaded and cooled things where people needed to move, right? So sidewalks and other places through which they're transiting. We also learned a bit about cooling spaces and transit challenges. So libraries and community centers served as cooling spaces, especially when they were paired with other social functions. So even if you are a senior and retired, you have things to do in your life. You're not necessarily going to go to a cooling center if it's not a place where you have other things to do, where your community is. At the same time, transit areas are often exacerbated heat stress, and so if you need to take transit to a cooling center, that's a big barrier. Heat and social isolation are the big theme, and we have heard about this in relation to the 2021 heat dome as well in previous research. So extreme heat, disrupted routines led to social isolation, especially for those who stayed indoors. And then participants also observed changing weather patterns and reflected on the increasing frequency and intensity of heat waves. So I'm going to leave you with a few key takeaways for what I think we need to advance urban green equity based on some of this research that I've shared today. First, we need inclusive understandings of what urban forestry is. There is sort of a mainstream definition of what urban forestry is, which is usually like planting street trees and plants. Those are great, those are really important, and I think we can expand the bounds of what urban forestry is to engage community stewardship and support it, so that we can improve first the ways in which we allow connection to the environment, but also the diversity of ways in which people may become or are already being stewards of their urban environment. Related to that, I really see humility as central in equitable urban greening work. So this means for urban forestry scholars as well as practitioners, maybe giving up some of our definitions of urban forestry to allow other people's expertise and work to expand that space. I think we need to intentionally learn from from under-resourced and marginalized communities' interests, knowledges, capacities, and energy. I have one of the people working on an Hours of Care project is Andrew Binet from the planning school at UBC, and they always say, "Oh, where is the energy?" And I find that to be a really interesting question. You know, like acknowledging the energy that communities are already putting into their communities and their environments. I think we can center the lived experiences of vulnerable residents in our work, and we need partnerships to co-create social ecological networks of care. I'm very much into care right now, care and urban greening. I want to acknowledge all the co-investigators on these projects and pieces of research I have shared. I don't know about anyone, but many are in my lab or otherwise students at UBC, but also professors at UBC and researchers in other institutions as well, academic and otherwise, who have been really important partners in thinking about this work and creating it with me and my students. I also want to acknowledge our many partners and funders who have lent their time to us, as well as the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for primarily funding this research, but also the Faculty of Forestry for providing really important scholarship and fieldwork funding for students engaging in this work as well. That is all.
Thanks a lot for this great presentation. We have 5 minutes for questions.
5 minutes? Oh,
And
sorry, I went too long.
because I think there must be a class here.
Okay.
We need to
Sorry.
move out.
It's all good.
Any questions for Lorien?
I think just really quickly, one, acknowledging why it could be frustrating to do this type of work because it's so intersectional. There's so many different dimensions and underlying systems of kind of oppression or marginalization that you have to kind of weed into, especially because, I mean, real estate development is such it's a very displacing type of process. So I think with the greening piece has a layer to it. So I think appreciating that. So thank you for doing this, but then continuing with this networks of care piece. Curious if you've seen other places in the world or cities, whether in Canada or elsewhere, that are doing this really well with incorporating the urban forest and greening to be more inclusive and just transition.
Thank you. That's a good question. I always hesitate to call out specific jurisdictions because no one's doing it perfectly. I know, so City of Portland has been working on equity issues for a long time across systems. They have like very aggressive goals around justice at the metro level, and then they've been thinking about green equity for a long time. They're also facing a lot of pressures, and so I haven't checked in with them about how they're doing in the last 5 years or so. I think some cities, you know, there's some European cities like Barcelona and Paris and stuff that have been moving towards, like, you know, more active transit, and increasing space for people to be out and about and in greenness, and so that can be seen as a form of care, but these are also, in some cases, perpetuating green gentrification, and so it seems to be a bit of a, you know, you can do some work, but it's hard to do it really well, especially when you have this development-driven approach to urban greening. That's actually something I'd like to engage with more in my future work, is just looking at cities, especially in the global south, that get lots of attention around sort of how networks of care are built from the ground up a little bit more, so less likely to be the municipal government and more just like local organizations doing that work. Yeah, thanks.
Questions for?
That was a wonderful presentation, synoptic view of your entire research group. In essence, I mean, what you're doing is taking a notion of equity being foundational and the relationship between communities on the one hand and the problem of developers and all of that at another level. But in a sense, you're also really problematizing notions of stewardship. Because so often questions of community and urban equity are, communities are sort of seen as stakeholders. But the radical aspect of what you're doing is redefining what stewardship is and finding it not in NGOs but a huge variety of local organizations, actually existing agencies. I wanted you reflect on that. I mean, I find it pretty radical in some senses, that there is stewardship in, you know, aged communities, in women's groups, in actually existing rather than formally defined.
Totally. Yeah, thank you for that. I have started to see it as, I mean, I don't know if stewardship is the word that everyone likes, right? But the ways in which we care for ourselves and our natures, our communities, as taking these different forms. And so like many residents are caring for their neighborhoods right now and caring for each other. And I don't see a meaningful distinction between caring for your neighbor and caring for the tree in front of your house, especially because they work together, and presumably, I mean, the ecosystem services paradigm says the tree is caring for us as well. And so highlighting these connections, I think helps us recognize that important work. And then we also do have stewardship from NGOs. We have stewardship, if we frame it in that way, from our municipal governments as well, right? Like there are different forms of stewardship, and I think they're all legitimate and they need to work together more, especially because our municipal systems are not able to support us in this current changing climate. And so we need to activate, I think, part of the networks of stewardship in a more intentional way.
Existing ones, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Music, right?
Any other question?
Yes.
So I was really intrigued about your discussions with communities about their ideal world versus their real world, and
Yeah. Well, so it's practitioners. It was expert.
so that got me thinking from your perspective, an ideal world at UBC and green space and equity and urban planning, what would be some advice you'd offer, or what would be a first step you would, if you could wave a magic wand at UBC, what should we be doing?
So the ideal world exercise was about very specific aspects of the ideal world, and I don't tend to say anything about ideal worlds generally that I want to create, because I don't think they're possible. I hate the concept of utopia, actually. But what I would like to see at UBC is democratic governance, actually. I think we fail to engage the people who are affected or affect the decisions that we're making, right? We have a hierarchical system where we do not give people the space to inform our decision making at the faculty level, at the university level. And those people also aren't given the opportunity to develop that sense of responsibility, right? So, and I think it goes both ways. If we want democracy, people have to put their energies into it, but also they have to see that if they're putting their energy in, they're gonna get real outcomes. I would love to see more democracy at use. Yay. Yeah, right.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I wanted to ask if your research and the findings, especially through the surveys that you have done and collaboration with community, Metro Vancouver, government, resulted in actually using any of the results in order to implement or change or any policy changes. Did your research actually inform any of these organizations that you showed us on the last page to do things differently? Because I've seen, for example, many of the developers now are forced to have a green space while they have a high rise, but then they do really poorly in having that. And usually that's the last thing or even delayed and with the work that you are doing with the city, with Metro Vancouver, are they thinking it?
Well, so I think the research that we've done on distributional equity has had influence, and it's not just our research, it's lots of people's research, right? So there is this awareness of the importance of equity. We see it a lot in plans and policies now, so that took like a good 15 years of work though, right? I don't know that we're seeing a big adoption of the concept of green gentrification yet. We are releasing a toolkit with Tree Canada in the next 6 months to try and get as a resource for practitioners. And so far, I think what we have been able to do is influence individual practitioners and organizations to adopt some of these lenses or practices. I don't know that they have made policy changes other than like in their smaller scope of work. I'm interested to see what comes out of these more recent projects. We haven't published anything from it yet. And so that's part of why we have these workshops at the end of the project to bring our practice partners together into conversation with our community members as co-researchers and experts in the field to talk about, you know, what does equitable climate resilience really look like? What does urban greening that is just look like in our city? So I'm hopeful that that type of more participatory, transdisciplinary design will lead to more policy impact. We'll see.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.